Welcome to yet another episode of our bus build series. A few episodes ago, we ripped everything out of the bus, including the old subfloor, which you can see here. In today's episode, we assess the sheet metal paneling underneath, prep it, and then install our new subfloor over top. After removing the plywood, we prepped the floors with metal sanding discs, getting off any leftover adhesive or corrosion, and got them looking real good again. As far as our sheet metal floor, we were super lucky to have zero rusted through spots or really any rust at all, which was great peace of mind going forward. To paint the floor, we used the same direct to metal paint we used on the exterior, as we had plenty left over. One thing to keep in mind before painting your floors is that buses typically have galvanized floors, which is a surface not recommended to paint. But for us, since we sanded the floor, it removed most of the zinc coating to help the paint adhere better. After painting the floor, we tackled filling in all of the screw and bolt holes in the floor. For that, we used a metal flashing tape to cover all hundreds of the holes. There's a lot of different techniques to fill these holes, but we went this route because the holes were so small and we liked how thin the tape was, so it applied real flush to the floor. After painting the floor and filling the holes, the next step was to get the subfloor installed. The product we used is very easy to install, and the company provides great tutorials on YouTube for anyone looking to install their product. The main keys to installation are gapping all of your edges on the outside perimeter to allow for expansion and contraction, and then staggering or offsetting the seams of each row to give you a stronger connection. We were only able to stagger our seams 6 to 8 inches just because of how the math worked with the size of each panel and the width of our bus, but overall the product installed very easy, seems strong, and has held up very well since installation. So before I go ahead and show you guys how our subfloor turned out, I just wanted to go over why we chose the subfloor option that we did and what other options we considered when thinking about how we were going to build our subfloor. The subfloor option we ended up going with is a Dricore panel. We ended up going with the Dricore R+ paneling. There are two versions of the Dricore paneling. The first version has a high density plastic on the bottom, and then the top layer is just a 1/2 inch tongue and groove OSB panel. The one we ended up going with has an XPS foam as the bottom layer, and then the same OSB tongue and groove top paneling. If you look at this, what's nice about this, and the reason we chose the R+ version, is because you get 1.5 higher R value on this panel than you would with the typical Dricore paneling, and this only costs 20 cents more per panel. So you're getting a lot more insulation value with this panel than you would be with the regular Dricore. The nice thing about this is it has grooves in it, so if you do get any type of moisture or water underneath your flooring, it does allow it to air out a little bit better. So this in total, we had to cover 100 square feet of flooring. We were able to spend only $220 for all of these panels. It worked out really good with the measurements of this bus. Our bus is 7.5 feet wide by 13 feet is going to be our living area. So what we were able to do is perfectly get away with just under 4 panels wide and 7 panels long. So that came out to be 28 panels, which was $220. Now, if we wanted to mock this Dricore panel, what we would need to do is get 4x8 tongue and groove OSB, and then we'd need to get a 1/2 inch XPS foam. And in order to do all of that and then glue it together, because this is glued together, so we'd need adhesive, plywood, and then the foam board, that would bring us up to a cost of roughly $250. So in order to mock this panel, we would have to pay more than we would if we just bought the Dricore paneling itself. So that was the second option, cross that right out right away. And then the next option would be a more traditional subfloor where you have studs and you frame out the entire floor of the bus, and then you fill your voids with a XPS foam. So now typically you'd go with maybe a 2x3 stud and you just run those along every 12 to 18 inches. And then you'd have to fill that with a 1.5 inch XPS foam in order to have a flush floor to run your plywood over. So now when you're doing something like that, what you have to consider cost-wise is you have to consider the plywood, the foam, the studs, screws, any adhesive, and then any thermal tape to seal up any of the seams. So if you went with something like that, that would cost you roughly $285 for our bus if we went with a basic OSB with no tongue and groove, and then with 1.5 inch XPS foam and 2x3s, and then of course screws, adhesive, and tape. Now if you upgraded your wood to tongue and groove and had the same, everything else was the same in that layout, you'd be looking at closer to $360 because the tongue and groove paneling is much more expensive than your standard OSB. Now if you wanted to go with a plywood sheathing option, you are looking close to $350 as well. So the main reasons we chose the Dricore paneling is because with how expensive lumber costs are right now, this actually came in cheaper than doing our own subfloor. And while we don't get the same R value that you would with a traditional subfloor where you'd have 1.5 inch foam board, and you'd get, I think, closer to an R value of 12 or 9, it's just the floor, and with how we're planning to use our bus and where we're planning to go, we're not anticipating needing that much insulation in our floor. So for us, the ease of installation, the cost, and then the last thing being how much you lose in headroom when you build up your floor. This is a 1 inch loss of headroom because we got a 1/2 inch piece of foam and a 1/2 inch panel of OSB. Now, if we would go with the more traditional route of a 2x3, you're looking at 1.5 inches. If you run them on their side, and then you put a 1/2 inch plywood over that, you're losing 2 inches of headroom. And then, of course, that doesn't include whatever you're going to put for flooring down. So we get an extra inch of headroom using this, a little bit less insulation, easier installation, lower cost, and more headroom. And with this being a budget build, we're really trying to save pennies wherever we can. So that's kind of the reason why we went with this Dricore R Plus paneling. And I'll show you how it turned out. And yeah. Okay, so this is how the subfloor ended up turning out. Looks pretty good. Everything came together pretty well. There are a few low spots, a couple high spots, but nothing major. Floor is pretty even, and installation was really quick. A couple cutouts for the gas filler, and then we had one over here for the intake, not take, for the heater. But other than that, this was a super easy installation. Took about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and it looks pretty good. Turned out pretty well. So while you watch me lay down the subfloor in the front driver's section, I want to talk about a quick tip on how you can evaluate the condition of the sheet metal floor so that you don't run into any unexpected surprises after ripping up the plywood. I've seen so many people rip up their plywood to find extensive rust that they didn't know about, in some cases to the point that they need to replace a majority of their floor. My tip to avoid this issue comes during the buying process. You want to really investigate each vehicle you look at. Remember, it's not rude to ask a lot of questions. Get under the bus and start poking around, and I do mean this literally. If you didn't know, the sheet metal under your plywood subfloor is the same sheet metal that's under the bus that gets exposed to all the environmental elements, which is typically why you see the floor rust. It's rusting from the outside in. So you'll need a flashlight, flathead screwdriver, and a small hammer in hand under the bus. Be sure to wear some safety goggles and start lightly hammering the sheet metal panels with the hammer, as well as scraping and poking the panels with the screwdriver. Odds are a lot of dirt and debris will fall, which is normal, but if you're getting big chunks of rust or scale falling from those panels, or if you can even poke your screwdriver through the metal panels, that's not a good sign. Shine the flashlight up. If you see any plywood at all, it means that that section of sheet metal has rusted through. Now, this may not be a deal breaker, especially if there are only a few spots and they are small or concentrated to a small area. But the only way to determine that is to test the entire bus using this process. If you get through the whole bus and only find a few bad spots, it still might be a bus worth buying. At least at this point, you know there will be some extra added cost, and you won't be surprised during the demo process. Knowing this might also give you some more room to negotiate with the seller if you tell them the floor has some holes in it. This tip can and should also be used on the frame of the bus, especially if it's an older bus or from an area that was exposed to excess road salt. The last thing you want is a bad metal floor and a bad frame, as these are the foundations of your home. I do want to mention you should ask the owner before you do this, because some people might not want some random person hammering on their bus, which is understandable. In this case, you can still perform the test just by using your hands with some gloves on, of course.